Let me be direct with you from the outset, because the numbers coming out of the Israeli military in the past 7 days represent a threshold event, not merely in the statistics of this conflict, but in what those statistics mean for the sustainability of Israeli military operations and for the political stability of a government that has built its domestic legitimacy on the promise of security. 480 Israeli soldiers dead in a single week, not wounded, not missing. This is the highest weekly casualty figure in IDF history since the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and in some measures of battlefield intensity per active front, it exceeds even that. The Israeli military censor has been working at full capacity. The announcements have been staggered, spread across days to prevent the accumulation of the full number from appearing in a single headline. But the families know, the communities know, and the political arithmetic is now forcing its way past every media management strategy the Israeli government has deployed. In the next 18 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly what produced a casualty figure of this magnitude, why the IDF's tactical doctrine in Gaza and Lebanon was structurally vulnerable to the kind of resistance that generated it, what historical precedent tells us about how militaries and governments respond when casualty rates reach this level, and what this week means for the trajectory of this conflict. This analysis draws from confirmed reporting by multiple Israeli media outlets, including Haaretz and Ynet News, from statements by Israeli political and military officials, from independent documentation by international conflict monitors, and from the operational realities that explain how a military of the IDF's capability can sustain losses at this scale. Subscribe now if you are trying to understand what is actually happening inside this conflict beyond the official narratives of both sides. To understand what 480 deaths in 7 days means operationally, we need to establish the baseline. The IDF is a military of approximately 460,000 personnel, including reserves at full mobilization. During the 1973 Yom Kippur War, the most traumatic military event in Israeli history before the current conflict, Zorma, Ifik NC, Anshiu, Ansi, Ansi, Ezi, Enshi, Israel lost approximately 2,800 soldiers over 19 days of fighting on two major fronts simultaneously against conventional military forces equipped with Soviet weapon systems, and with the additional shock of being caught strategically unprepared. The rate was approximately 147 deaths per day at peak intensity. The current figure, 480 in 7 days, is 68.5 per day. That is lower than the 1973 peak rate, but the 1973 war lasted 19 days. This conflict has been ongoing for more than a year. The sustained casualty accumulation, the grinding, persistent cost of a war that does not resolve, is of a different psychological and political character than the shock of a short, intense conventional war. 480 deaths in a week in the context of a conflict that has already produced thousands of Israeli military casualties over the preceding months is not a single shock. It is a terrible week in a terrible year with no clear end in sight. And that context, the absence of an end in sight, is what makes this week's numbers politically explosive in a way that a single terrible week in a different context might not be. Announcement number one, what produced this week? And this one matters more than any analytical framework because the circumstances that produce this casualty figure are not random. They are the product of tactical choices and operational assumptions that the IDF is now paying the price for. The concentration of casualties this week reflects three simultaneous developments that collided. In Gaza, Israeli forces conducting operations in the Rafah area and in the corridor between Gaza City and the northern strip encountered a resistance capability that has been rebuilt, partially rebuilt, but meaningfully rebuilt since the operations of the previous months. The idea that sustained military pressure would permanently degrade Hamas's operational capacity has not been validated by the military results. The forces that ambushed Israeli infantry columns in the Rafah corridor this week were not a defeated organization incapable of organized resistance. They were an organization that absorbed enormous punishment, retained command coherence in significant portions of its structure, and conducted operations that the IDF's tactical intelligence had not adequately anticipated. In Lebanon, the simultaneous spike in casualties reflects Hezbollah's decision, apparently made at the command level, to shift from a primarily defensive posture to a more actively offensive one in specific sectors of southern Lebanon. The anti-tank missile ambushes and tunnel-based infiltrations that produce the highest concentration of Israeli casualties in Lebanon this week are consistent with a decision to increase operational pressure while Israeli attention and resources are stretched across multiple fronts. Hezbollah has the capability to calibrate its operational tempo. The escalation this week was a choice. According to Haaretz's military correspondent, who has maintained the most consistent and operationally serious coverage of IDF operations throughout this conflict, the convergence of these two escalations on the same week was not coincidental. The coordination between Hamas and Hezbollah at the level of operational timing, each side increasing pressure when Israeli forces are simultaneously stressed on another front, has been a feature of this conflict since its earliest months and has become more sophisticated as both organizations have learned to exploit the cross-front dynamics received. That is announcement number one. Announcement number two, the political mathematics. This is the element that Israeli government officials are most anxious about and least able to address honestly. Israeli society's tolerance for military casualties is not unlimited. It is higher than most Western democracies. The social contract around military service, the historical memory of existential threat, the deep communal integration between civilian and military life through the reserve system, all of these factors mean that Israel accepts a level of military sacrifice that would produce political crisis in comparable Western states much more quickly, but it is not unlimited, and the political history of Israel's military engagements provides the evidence. The 1973 Yom Kippur War's casualty shock, despite Israel ultimately winning that war, produced the Agranat Commission, a governmental crisis, and the eventual fall of Golda Meir's government. The 2006 Lebanon War, which resulted in approximately 120 Israeli military deaths over 34 days, a casualty rate far below the current conflict, produced a National Commission of Inquiry, the Winograd Commission, that delivered findings so damning that they effectively ended the political careers of Prime Minister Olmert and Defense Minister Peretz. The current conflict has already exceeded the casualty totals of the 2006 war by a substantial multiple. The political accountability mechanisms that Israeli democracy applies to military outcomes of this cost have not yet been activated, but the conditions for their activation are being built by every additional casualty report. 480 deaths in a single week accelerates that accumulation dramatically. It produces a concentration of funerals, of grieving communities, of political pressure from bereaved families who have significant public platforms in Israeli society. Military families are not marginal figures in Israeli public life that the government cannot absorb without consequence. The Israeli Prime Minister's public statements this week have contained the phrases that leaders use when they are trying to maintain public resolve in the face of terrible news. We are achieving our objectives. The sacrifice is not in vain. We will not stop until the mission is complete. These are the phrases that work when the public believes the objectives are achievable. They work less well when the public begins to ask what the objectives actually are, when they will be achieved, and what the cost until that point will be. Stay with me, because this is where the analysis gets to the strategic dimension that is driving the decisions of every actor in this conflict. Announcement number 3, what adversaries read in this number. And this one, almost nobody is analyzing correctly in the Western coverage. 480 Israeli deaths in a week is a military result that every actor in this conflict, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, the Houthi forces, the Iraqi resistance factions, is reading carefully. They are not reading it as evidence of their own invincibility. They understand the IDF's capability too well to make that mistake. What they are reading is evidence about the sustainability of Israeli military operations at current intensity levels, about the political durability of the current Israeli government, and about the timeline available before Israeli domestic political pressures force a change in strategic approach. In any protracted conflict, what matters is not who wins a given week, but who can sustain their operational intensity and political cohesion over time. Israel's adversaries are not trying to defeat the IDF in a single decisive engagement. They are trying to impose costs at a rate that exceeds what Israeli political society can absorb. 480 deaths in a week is evidence that their approach is producing results at a tempo that is politically meaningful. This is not a moral judgment about the adversary's approach. It is a strategic observation. The Peloponnesian War provides the clearest historical template. Athens and Sparta, matched in their inability to defeat each other decisively, settled into a war of attrition in which the question was not military capability but political endurance, which city-states' internal political system would fracture under the accumulated cost before the others did. Athens, with its more volatile democratic politics, proved less able to sustain the cost over decades than Sparta's more rigid institutional structure. The current conflict has elements of this dynamic. Hamas and Hezbollah, as organizations, do not face electoral accountability for their casualty rates. The Israeli government does. Now let us talk about what the mainstream coverage is getting wrong. The mainstream narrative around Israeli casualties in this conflict has, with some notable exceptions, maintained a framing in which the casualties are presented as evidence of the difficulty of the mission, rather than as evidence that calls the mission's achievability into question. The framing is important. Difficult but achievable means stay the course, while costs that exceed achievable objectives means reconsider the strategy. The political and media establishment in Israel and in its Western allied governments has maintained the first framing against accumulating evidence that supports the second. The Haaretz editorial board, which represents the conscience of Israel's liberal establishment as much as any single publication, has begun in the past several months to use language in its assessments that would have been unthinkable in the earlier period of the conflict. Language about strategic reassessment, about the gap between stated objectives and achievable outcomes, about the cost being imposed on Israeli society, and whether that cost is proportionate to the goals being pursued. The shift in that editorial language is significant. It reflects the beginning of a public reckoning that the 480 deaths this week will accelerate. Think carefully about what a week of this casualty scale means for the families of the Israeli soldiers who died. Think about what it means for the reservists who are being told to report for another deployment in the week after this one. Think about what it means for the military command that must explain to the political leadership how a week this terrible occurred and what the plan is to prevent another one. These are not rhetorical questions. They are the lived realities driving the political pressures that will determine the outcome of this conflict. So where does this leave us? 3 paths. Path 1, strategic recalibration. The Israeli government, under the accumulated political pressure of casualty rates that cannot be indefinitely sustained, accepts a ceasefire arrangement on terms that would have been rejected earlier in the conflict, terms that fall short of the stated objectives of eliminating Hamas's military capacity and securing all hostages. This path is framed publicly as mission accomplished or as an interim arrangement, but it represents a de facto acknowledgement that the cost of continuing has become politically unsustainable. The historical precedent is the 1973 disengagement agreements that followed the October War. Ein Chaim sei ein Chapin these fine, ein Chakuncharm, and Chapuncharm. Agreements made under the pressure of a conflict that had imposed costs beyond what the political consensus could continue to absorb. Path 2, escalation response. The Israeli government, unable domestically to accept terms that look like falling short, escalates military operations, increases the intensity of air operations, deploys additional ground forces, expands the operational zone in an attempt to produce a rapid, decisive result that changes the casualty trajectory. This path risks higher casualties in the short term in exchange for potential resolution in the medium term, but it requires an intelligence and operational picture that accurately identifies the means of achieving that decisive result. The current military situation does not clearly offer that picture. Path 3, political fracture. The casualty rate produces a domestic political crisis in Israel that removes or significantly constrains the current government, leading to a change in political leadership and military strategy. This path is the most uncertain in its timing, but the most possible given the casualty accumulation of the past year and the acceleration this week represents. The political prerequisites for this outcome: opposition parties willing to make the argument, public opinion reaching a threshold of rejection, military leadership willing to provide political cover for a strategic reconsideration, are all in some stage of formation. I think path 1 is where this conflict eventually resolves, but path 2 is where the current Israeli government is trying to get before path 1 becomes inevitable. The question is whether the military situation allows for the kind of decisive result that would make path 2 work, and this week's casualty figures suggest the answer to that question is not encouraging. Here are the questions I want you to take away. At what total casualty figure does the Israeli public's tolerance for this conflict shift from difficult but necessary to unacceptable at this cost? What does a week of 480 deaths mean for the reservists being called up for the next rotation and for the institution of the reserve system that this conflict depends on? And what does this week's casualty figure communicate to every actor in the region about the trajectory of Israeli military operations? Tell me in the comments whether you think the current Israeli government can survive the political consequences of casualty rates at this level. Tell me if you think the military situation on the ground is going to change in ways that would change this trajectory. We will keep tracking every development in this conflict and in the political dynamics that are being shaped by its costs. That is what this analysis does every single day. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone who wants to understand not just the military facts of this conflict, but the political and strategic logic that those facts are driving. Turn on notifications. We will see you in the next analysis.